There are moments in life when a man pauses and wonders, was that whisper in his soul the voice of God, or merely the echo of his own restless thoughts? The question itself is as old as faith, yet as urgent as the hour you are living in now. For if one cannot distinguish between divine leading and the inventions of his own heart, then he will wander endlessly, mistaking shadows for light. The first thing to recognize is this: God's voice never argues, never chatters, never attempts to persuade with cleverness. It is not like your thoughts, which twist and turn in restless debates, running in circles of what if and maybe. When God speaks, the words arrive with a weight of quiet certainty. They do not arrive like guests at a noisy banquet, but like a king entering a room. The soul knows, almost instinctively, that it has been addressed by something higher than itself. Consider how your thoughts usually behave. They hurry, they contradict, they fluctuate with your moods, they chase after desires, fears, and half-formed imaginations. They are loud in the morning when you wake with worries, and they are scattered at night when your mind replays the day's failures and triumphs. Your thoughts are tied to your condition, your weariness, your hunger, your hopes. They rise and fall like the sea, but God's voice does not ride upon these waves. It comes steady, firm, and often cutting through the noise with a clarity that silences all the inner commotion. Another mark is this: God's voice draws you toward what is right, even when it costs you something dear. Your thoughts, however, often bend toward convenience, comfort, and self-defense. When you hear a leading that calls you to humility when your pride is wounded, to forgiveness when you burn for revenge, to truth when a lie would shield you, then you have likely heard not your own heart, but God. For man's thoughts rarely invent such costly paths on their own, and here lies a secret. God's voice bears peace, even when it commands a hard road, not the peace of ease, but the deep assurance that you are walking in harmony with the truth. Your thoughts, in contrast, promise peace if only you avoid the difficulty, take the shortcut, or satisfy the desire. Yet these promises unravel quickly, leaving you restless again. God's command may trouble your comfort, but it does not trouble your soul. Instead, it steadies it. If you are ever unsure, test the fruit. What follows after obeying what you heard? If it leads to greater love, to humility, to courage, to purity, then you can be certain you were guided from above. But if it leaves you with bitterness, arrogance, fear, or despair, then you were listening to the murmurs of your own thoughts. God's voice builds, your thoughts scatter. God's voice humbles, your thoughts inflate. God's voice leads you out of yourself. Your thoughts often trap you within yourself. And let us not forget, God's voice is often quieter than you expect. It does not thunder to impress, but whispers to invite. Your thoughts demand attention, shouting for immediate action, but God speaks as though He has all eternity, because He does. To catch His voice requires stillness, a willingness to quiet the frantic noise inside. If you cannot be silent within, His whisper will always be drowned. So the difference is not as hidden as you fear. You already know it deep down, for your soul was fashioned to recognize its Maker's call. Just as a child knows the sound of his father's footsteps long before seeing his face, so the believer learns to tell the difference between his own musings and the Father's summons. The question is not whether God speaks, but whether we will set aside our noisy thoughts long enough to hear Him. God's voice carries calm certainty, while your thoughts are restless, scattered, and self-driven. When we try to distinguish between God's voice and our own thoughts, the first clear difference is in the character of how they come to us. God's voice carries calm certainty, while our thoughts are restless, scattered, and self-driven. To understand this, one must pay attention not only to what is being said within, but also to the manner in which it arrives. Our thoughts are often like flocks of birds startled into the air, darting one way and then another, unpredictable, fleeting, and unstable. They follow moods, impulses, and sudden desires, shifting with the tide of our emotions. At one moment they may be confident, at the next they collapse into doubt. They can push us with urgency and then abandon us in hesitation. This restless quality betrays their human origin, for our minds are bound to our weaknesses, our habits, and our anxieties. In contrast, when God speaks, there is no sense of argument or turmoil. His voice does not demand attention by shouting, nor does it fight for dominance among competing thoughts. It enters the soul with a weight that silences the noise, as though the clamor of arguments falls still in the presence of one whose authority cannot be questioned. This certainty is not arrogance but assurance, not loudness but clarity. A man may doubt his own reasoning, second, guess his instincts and waver in indecision, but when the word of God comes to him, there is an unmistakable sense of stability. It is like standing on rock after slipping across shifting sand. Think of the way human thoughts often trouble us. They hurry from one possibility to another, filling the mind with anxious rehearsals of what may go wrong, or feeding the imagination with pictures of what might be gained. They are fueled by desire, fear, pride, and insecurity. They whisper, "What if this fails?" or "What if that succeeds?" They push and pull in opposite directions, leading to confusion. God's voice, however, is never anxious, never rushed. It does not multiply what-ifs. It simply states, it simply directs, and in its simplicity it carries a weight of authority that needs no persuasion. One can observe this difference when faced with moral decisions. Our thoughts may rush forward with reasons to justify ourselves, to excuse an action, or to delay obedience. They pile up arguments, justifications, and distractions. But when God speaks, the instruction is plain, sometimes painfully plain. He does not present a debate, he presents truth, and truth, when heard, has a ring that no amount of mental noise can imitate. It cuts through the entanglement of our restless inner reasoning and leaves us with the awareness that the choice is no longer clouded. It is now clear. Another mark of this certainty is the absence of self-interest. Our thoughts almost always circle back to self-preservation, self-promotion, self-comfort, self-justification. They are like a mirror reflecting our desires in 1,000 fragments. But the voice of God does not flatter the self, nor does it cater to ego. Instead, it speaks in a way that lifts the heart beyond itself, calling us to something higher, something unselfish, something rooted in truth rather than convenience. When you notice a stirring within that draws you away from self-centeredness and into love, humility, or obedience, you may recognize that it is not born of your restless human mind, but of the calm certainty of God's Spirit. We may also notice how our thoughts grow louder when we resist them. The more we try not to think of something, the more persistent it becomes. Thoughts argue, they return, they insist on being heard. But the voice of God does not behave like this. He does not argue for recognition. His word remains steady, unchanging, even if ignored. The thoughts of man fade when they lose attention, only to be replaced by another thought. But God's direction lingers with a quiet persistence that does not weaken. Even when set aside, it waits, unaltered, until we return to it. It is also important to note the emotional tone. Thoughts often leave us agitated, unsettled, and even weary. We can spend hours debating with ourselves internally, circling the same ground, only to find ourselves exhausted without clarity. God's voice, by contrast, even when it convicts or challenges, brings a sense of calm beneath the weight of the words. It does not leave the soul in confusion, but in a strange and certain stillness. It may confront, it may call for sacrifice, but it does so without the frenzy of human reasoning. It is calm because it comes from the one who is never uncertain. This calm certainty has been recognized by those who walk closely with God. They will often say that the difference is not in volume, but in quality. Thoughts can be loud and urgent, but feel thin and fleeting. God's voice can be quiet, yet feels substantial, as if it carries eternity within it. Even when a thought seems clever, if it is restless or self-driven, it is not the same as the voice that comes with holy gravity. The believer learns over time to sense this difference, not by analyzing endlessly, but by listening and comparing what bears the marks of peace, authority, and truth against what bears the marks of hurry, confusion, and self. So we see that the restlessness of our thoughts betrays their weakness. They are tied to our flesh, to our shifting emotions, and to the brokenness of our human nature. But God's voice comes from outside us, higher than us, and it is not subject to our instability. It brings with it a certainty that does not depend on our moods or our reasoning. To train oneself to hear it is to learn to quiet the noise and recognize the difference between the restless churning of our thoughts and the calm assurance of the divine voice. God's voice calls you to righteousness at personal cost, while your thoughts seek comfort and convenience. God's voice calls you to righteousness at personal cost, while your thoughts seek comfort and convenience. This difference can be recognized whenever you are faced with a choice that touches both conscience and desire. The natural pull of human thought is to take the smoother road, the one with fewer obstacles, the one that does not demand sacrifice. It seeks justification for choosing what is easy, and it persuades you that avoiding difficulty is wisdom. Yet the voice of God does not flatter you with such an escape. It directs you toward truth, even when that truth will wound your pride, empty your hands, or place you in the shadows rather than the spotlight. His call is not to the path of least resistance, but to the path of eternal reward, which often begins with immediate cost. One can see this difference in the matter of forgiveness. Your thoughts may rush to defend your right to remain angry, to rehearse again and again the injuries done to you, to magnify the offense so that withholding forgiveness seems reasonable. They may whisper that forgiving is weakness, that it lets the offender go unpunished, that it dishonors your pain. Yet God's voice comes quietly and simply, "Forgive as you have been forgiven." This word cuts against the grain of human desire. It requires you to let go of pride, to absorb the pain rather than repay it. It feels costly, and it is, because it requires death to self. But this very cost reveals its divine origin. Human thought rarely invents such commands, because human thought seeks comfort, while God seeks righteousness. Another example lies in honesty. When tempted to shade the truth, to conceal a failure, or to exaggerate success, your thoughts will quickly build a case for doing so. They will say, "No one will know," or "It will save you trouble," or "This is harmless." They urge you toward convenience, convincing you that dishonesty is practical and that survival depends on bending the truth. But God's voice is unbending. Speak the truth, and that command may lead to embarrassment, to loss of reputation, or even to loss of opportunity. Obedience in such moments costs something dear, yet it is this very cost that marks it as divine. For the human mind does not naturally seek to lose, it seeks to gain. The voice that calls you to lose for the sake of what is right is not the voice of self, but of God. Your thoughts also protect your pride. When you are wronged, they clamor for defense, for retaliation, for the preservation of dignity. They will suggest sharp words, cutting replies, or strategies to prove yourself superior. They make obedience to humility feel unreasonable, but God's voice gently calls you to turn the other cheek, to bless those who curse you, to answer with gentleness rather than venom. It is a call that stings the ego and demands that you step down from the throne of self. That sting, that pain of surrender, is the sign that this is not your own thought. For no natural thought invents a command to humble oneself when pride cries out for satisfaction. The pursuit of convenience is also seen in how thoughts argue against generosity. When faced with a need, your thoughts calculate what you can spare without discomfort. They tally the risk, they measure how giving will affect your comfort, and they conclude that safety lies in holding back. God's voice, however, urges generosity beyond what feels secure. Give not from your excess, but from your heart. Give even when it means you will have less. This kind of command unsettles the self-preserving logic of human reasoning. It requires trust, and trust feels costly because it asks you to surrender the control you cling to. It is precisely in that surrender, that step into discomfort, that the mark of God's voice is found. We may also observe this difference in how our thoughts approach obedience. Human reasoning seeks to bargain. It asks, how little can I do and still be acceptable? It searches for loopholes, for shortcuts, for minimal effort. It resists the demands of holiness because holiness demands everything. God's voice, by contrast, never speaks in half measures. It calls for wholehearted devotion. It says, take up your cross and not carry what is comfortable. It demands the laying down of idols, the cutting away of sins cherished in secret, the surrender of areas we prefer to protect. Such commands are not convenient, not easy, not aligned with self-interest, and that is why they can be recognized as divine rather than human. Even in the daily choices of conduct, the distinction is clear. Your thoughts may tell you to speak harshly when patience is strained, to indulge desire when no one is watching, to remain silent when truth must be spoken. They reason that silence avoids conflict, indulgence brings pleasure, and harshness feels like strength. These are the paths of convenience, yet God's voice cuts across them with quiet authority. Speak the truth in love, deny yourself, be slow to anger, endure with patience. His way always leads upward, but the climb demands effort, and effort feels costly. At times, the difference between God's call and your thoughts can be recognized by the very resistance it produces within you. When you sense a direction that makes you recoil because it will require humility, honesty, or sacrifice, you can be certain that such a command did not arise from the part of you that seeks ease. It is in the commands you least wish to obey that God's voice most clearly reveals itself, for they strike at the root of selfishness. The human mind invents excuses to avoid such demands. The Spirit of God brings them with unavoidable clarity. The human heart is a master of self-protection. It chooses the path that costs the least and benefits the most in the short term. It is quick to adjust morality so that convenience and conscience can coexist. But the divine voice is uncompromising, pressing you into paths that may wound your pride, empty your purse, or burden your flesh, but that purify your soul. It is in this unwavering call to righteousness, even at great personal cost, that one learns to recognize the difference between what is merely a thought and what is truly the voice of God. God's voice produces lasting peace and fruit, while your thoughts leave confusion and emptiness. God's voice produces lasting peace and fruit, while your thoughts leave confusion and emptiness. When you pause long enough to notice the aftermath of what stirs within, the difference becomes clear. Thoughts that originate from self often promise relief, excitement, or gain, but what they leave behind is unrest, dissatisfaction, and the hunger for more. They push you toward choices that feel good in the moment but collapse into regret when the moment has passed. They may create a temporary sense of control or pleasure, yet afterward you are left searching again because they cannot sustain the soul. God's voice, however, though it may challenge you at first, always plants something that endures. It leaves peace that is not fragile, peace that does not depend on circumstance, and it bears fruit that remains long after the moment of obedience. Think about the way your thoughts drive you when fear grips the heart. They scatter, they conjure the worst possible outcomes. They demand that you prepare for disasters that may never come. They multiply scenarios, each one more unsettling than the last, and the more you follow them, the less peace you find. Fearful thoughts leave you restless, unable to sleep, unable to trust, always on edge. But when God speaks in the midst of fear, His voice is altogether different. It does not feed panic, but calms it. It reminds you that He is present, that He is sovereign, that He has not abandoned you. And though the danger may still be real, the word He gives settles the soul. It produces the kind of peace that can rest in the middle of the storm, not because the storm is gone, but because the heart has been anchored. That kind of peace is beyond what thoughts alone can manufacture, for thoughts cannot rise above the fear that generates them. The fruit of God's voice is also evident in the choices it guides. When you obey the restless impulses of your thoughts, you often find that what they promise does not last. A thought driven by greed tells you that gaining more will satisfy, but after gaining it, you soon want again. A thought driven by lust promises satisfaction, but afterward there is guilt and emptiness. A thought driven by pride convinces you that proving yourself will finally bring contentment, yet after proving it, you still feel insecure. These are the patterns of human thought. They promise but cannot deliver. God's voice, in contrast, leads to actions that bear fruit not only for the moment, but for the future. Acts of obedience produce joy that does not fade. Choices rooted in His leading bring growth in character, deepened love, and strength of spirit. The distinction can also be traced in clarity. Thoughts born from self often leave you more confused after following them. They may offer a dozen different reasons to act, yet each reason contradicts the next. They keep you turning in circles, never fully convinced, never fully at rest. God's voice does not confuse. It may be quiet, but it is clear. It directs without contradiction. Even if you do not see the full path ahead, the step He calls you to take is simple and unmistakable. And when you take it, the fruit of peace follows. This peace is not the absence of struggle, but the settled confidence that you are moving in alignment with truth. Another way the difference reveals itself is in the aftermath of disobedience. When you follow your own thoughts, even if they seemed wise in the moment, the emptiness that follows tells the truth. Your heart feels hollow, your conscience uneasy, your spirit restless. That is the fruit of self-driven reasoning. But when you ignore God's voice, the absence of peace is sharper still. His word continues to echo, not in the restless way of thoughts that demand attention, but in the steady way of truth that does not vanish. The lack of peace exposes where you departed from His leading, and the longing for restoration reveals the fruit you forfeited. It is also telling that the fruit of God's voice extends beyond yourself. Human thoughts, even when they seem noble, often circle back to self-benefit. They may appear generous but secretly seek recognition. They may appear wise but secretly guard pride. Their fruit is shallow because it is self-centered. God's voice, however, bears fruit that blesses others as well as yourself. When you obey his leading to serve, to give, to speak, or to remain silent, the effect often ripples outward. Others are lifted, truth is honored, and the kingdom is advanced. Such outcomes cannot be produced by self-seeking thoughts, because self does not willingly bear fruit for others. The lasting nature of God's peace is another mark of authenticity. Thoughts may calm you for a moment with rationalizations, telling you that everything will be fine because of your own abilities, resources, or plans. But that calm breaks the moment those abilities or plans fail. It is fragile peace, easily shattered. God's peace, however, is not dependent on circumstances. It is rooted in his unchanging nature. Even when nothing in your situation changes, even when the future looks uncertain, the peace remains. It is not built on probability, but on promise. This lasting peace is something human thought cannot mimic, for human thought must always cling to what can be controlled, and control can never be guaranteed. We may see the fruit of God's voice in the way it transforms character. When you follow your own thoughts, they may lead you to temporary gain, but they rarely make you more loving, more patient, more humble, or more faithful. Often they make you more anxious, more defensive, more self-centered. God's voice, on the other hand, never leaves you as you were. Obedience to his call reshapes you, chiseling away pride, deepening compassion, strengthening endurance. These changes are fruit that cannot be produced by restless thoughts. They remain long after the moment of decision, shaping who you are becoming. In the end, the test lies in the trail left behind. When you trace the path of your thoughts, the trail is often littered with confusion, regret, and emptiness. When you trace the path of God's voice, the trail is lined with peace that endures, fruit that lasts, and a heart that grows more aligned with truth. The difference is not subtle when you are willing to look honestly. One leaves you empty, the other fills you. One scatters, the other builds. One unsettles, the other anchors. The voice that produces lasting peace and fruit is not your own. It is the voice of God,